We're going to fast forward into the new year. Some economists have been getting bullish lately, raising their 2011 forecasts, citing, for example, the extension of the Bush tax cuts as a possible boost to the economy. But our next guest also sees some major headwinds on the horizon. We welcome economics and law professor William Black from the University of Missouri, Kansas City. Professor Black is author of the book, The Best Way to Rob a Bank is to Own One. It's about the savings and loan industry, and we'll definitely talk about financials. Professor Black, good to have you here.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So what are the most significant headwinds, do you think, in 2011?
Well, the two disastrous things potentially are the ones that have been hanging on the horizon. One has already hit in part, and that's the crisis in the European periphery, the pigs. And the second is, when will the Chinese bubbles burst? Both of those events are large enough to roil international events.
You know, that's a good point. You know, it's funny, we talk about here the European situation seems to, you know, come into the forefront, impact the markets, and then it goes away for a couple of days. But that situation still has a long way to go in terms of being dealt with, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It's not dealt with at all. You can see that the Chinese government is very worried about the bubbles and keeps trying to experiment. But there's no reason to be confident that they can engineer a soft landing.
Okay, but Europe specifically, I mean, that too, I mean, a long way before being dealt with, correct?
Getting worse, and you're only seeing right now the financial shoe. You're starting to see some of the economic shoe, but by that I mean you're seeing unemployment going up in Spain, in Greece, but the other shoe that's going to drop is the political shoe. Governments cannot remain in power with 20% unemployment. So you're going to see very substantial radical right and left swings in the periphery in Europe, and that too is going to create political risk and eventually economic and budgetary risk.
What's the fallout then globally? I mean, does the U.S. feel it? No doubt about that.
The U.S. feels it, but the biggest fallout is that the euro doesn't work. And so the periphery is going to be choking on a strong euro, unless the euro falls dramatically in value, and there's really no evidence of that. So you can expect places like Greece, Spain, Portugal to have extreme difficulty exporting. And the real question is, when does this spread, and how severely does it spread to Italy?
I mean, so the European...
And there you're going to get...
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Southern versus northern differences.
Well, and that's a good point. I mean, does the European Union come undone in your view?
The European Union potentially comes undone 20 years from now. The euro potentially comes undone in 3 or 4 years. And again, that's going to be a political reaction. We've talked about the periphery in politics, but we have to talk about Germany and politics. And you can see just how upset the average German in the street is about being the piggy bank for Europe.
Well, and you know, that's something we've certainly discussed here a lot at Bloomberg. I mean, when does the citizens of Germany say enough is enough? We're not, you know, taking care of everyone. We're not bailing everybody out. I mean, you see that playing out?
Yeah, probably the next election. That's close.
All right. Let's talk a little bit more about China. Europe, obviously, a big global situation we have to watch, as you pointed out. China, too. We did get some news over the weekend on Christmas with the PBOC raising interest rates again. Expectations for more, certainly the folks we're talking to expect more from the Chinese central bank come early next year.
Well, the central thing to keep in mind with regard to all Chinese governmental data is you should not trust it.
Transparency, you mean?
Well, not just transparency. There are strong incentives in the Chinese system for the lower level bureaucrats to lie about the numbers. And they have lied about the numbers on virtually all important data for decades. So the numbers often don't foot. In other words, you look at what is supposedly happening in one sector, and then you look at energy consumption, and the numbers don't track. Probably many of your viewers have seen the satellite photos of the ghost developments in China. You can, if you visited Ireland, you can see the ghost developments there. You can see them in Spain. Well, so in Ireland and Spain, they cause a crisis when those bubbles burst. I see no reason why it won't happen in China as well.
Well, you know, I've talked with noted short seller Jim Chanos in depth about those ghost cities over in China, and really, if you look at the pictures, it's kind of startling. Is their housing crisis going to be as severe as the housing crisis we've lived here in the United States, still living through, really?
Well, I don't. The housing crisis will be severe, but in different directions because of the enormous income disparities and the geographic disparities between the more developed coast and the hinterlands of China. So it's going to play out in more complex ways in China, and that's bad in terms of exacerbating some of the social divisions that the People's Republic, the party, is so worried about. Economically, that housing crisis is lagged, and how badly it's lagged depends on how much people lie about the numbers. So, for example, Spain has a massive crisis in housing, but it's still, you can see in the stress tests in the banks that it's lying about the numbers as well. It's not just the Chinese government that lies about numbers. You mentioned the Chinese government lying about numbers, so they're overestimating, so when they show growth, it's not as strong. When they talk about inflation, it's not as high, or what in your view? It actually goes in both directions, but you're right in general that they overreport a lot of positive developments and they underreport a lot of negative developments. Also, simply, the whole way that inflation works, an economy that is hybrid, it's not really free, it's not really completely government controlled, is different than it would in the United States, for example. What do you anticipate for the financials in 2011? Are they a headwind, if you will, to the economy next year? I think so. We have continued policies that are exceptionally big bank friendly. So we still have extraordinarily low interest rate at which they can borrow. The Fed still has taken their toxic assets off the books. The accounting rules remain gimmicked, so they don't have to recognize their losses. As you said in the lead-in, the tax cuts should be materially stimulative. All this is really good news for the big banks. Plus, the government really believes in this too big to fail stuff. So there's one set of rules for the big banks and another ones for the small banks. Small banks still have big problems, and they have massive overconcentration in commercial real estate. We have glutted markets in the United States. It depends on the region, but some of them, like Atlanta, are absolute disasters. So bad news for smaller banks. So it's the small banks that present the headwinds, not necessarily the big players, the major players. Yeah, so it's different. The big guys, they get a lot of wind in their sails. The bad guys still fighting against the wind. What about the small guys? What about the insider trading investigations that have been going on over the last few months, and then kind of tying hedge funds into all of this? Does that present a headwind as well, do you think, next year? I don't think so. I think that there'll be individual disruptions, of course, to particular funds when they announce that they've been indicted. But I don't think anybody wins from this kind of insider trading. And one of the big stories in finance, of course, is that the regular man and woman in the streets has still largely withdrawn from the stock market. If you want to get those people back in, you want it not to be viewed as a rigged market. If you have successful prosecutions and the market is viewed as fairer, you may get more common people back in. One market, though, that everybody's kind of looking at, again, we've kind of looked at it on and off over the last year or so, is the muni market. And Meredith Whitney certainly created some waves when she went on 60 Minutes and really talked about concern. She talked about up to 50 to 100 U.S. cities could default on their muni bonds over the next 18 months. 60 Minutes called the segment the Day of Reckoning. What do you think about the muni bond market? Is that also something we've got to keep a close watch on in 2011, or do states start to get their fiscal houses in order and the economy kind of helps it along? Well, the only good news there is the federal tax cuts and their stimulation, because this is one of those really gratuitous self-inflicted wounds. In the original stimulus bill, there was a provision for substantial revenue sharing to avoid precisely this state and local crisis. And revenue sharing is a good conservative Republican idea. For reasons that pass all understanding, the Republicans and the conservative Democratic Blue Dogs got together and killed that portion of the bill, even though everybody knew it was going to produce an economic crisis in the states and localities. So, yeah, we're going to have more bankruptcies. I doubt in the near term that we're going to be anywhere near the number that she's talking about. But you're going to get series of downgrades as you get more bad news on pensions.
Sounds like net we've got a lot to tackle certainly next year. Professor Black, thank you so much for your time today. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Bill Black, Associate Professor of Economics and Law at the University of Missouri, Kansas City.